Hello, I'm Aaron Johnston, and this is The Life and Death of Colonel James Gardiner, a look at the life of one of the most famous residents of Prestonpans battlefield and the highest ranking casualty on the field when the battle was fought in September 1745. This is a synopsis of a talk I gave live at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum on the 11th of January 2025, and it forms part of our Beyond the Battle research project, which tries to shed a light on what this community was like and who lived here at the time of the battle. So, where better to begin than with one of the most famous residents, his house, Bankton, still there today as a substantial memorial not only to James Gardiner, but his role in the battle too. Now, it's fair to say that Colonel Gardiner's story has dominated the way that the battle's story has been told almost ever since the fighting stopped. Look at the centre image here, and you can see the large stone obelisk dedicated to Gardiner's memory. This was built in 1853 by public subscription, so over 100 years after the battle itself, Gardiner was considered famous enough and worthy enough to warrant a very significant monument. And now, just to put that into context, that's almost 30 years before the memorial cairn goes up at Culloden battlefield. So this monument tells us something about the way the battle is being remembered. Nor is it the only monument to Gardiner on the field. The Thorn Tree Monument, which stands closer in towards the centre of the battlefield itself, erected in the 1990s, also recalling Colonel Gardiner's death. The thorn tree that monument refers to was the hawthorn where Gardiner's mortally wounded form was found at the end of the battle, and that tree was revered as a very significant landmark right through into the early 20th century, by which time it died and the remnants were blown down in a storm. But we have a fragment of it preserved on display in our museum today. Bankton House, Colonel Gardiner's former home, has been restored. It was restored at the end of the 20th century at great expense and effort because of the significance of its connection to the battle through Colonel Gardiner. Gardiner's also remembered in literature too, in poem and song, and in the historical novel Waverley by Walter Scott. And I've put on the left there a particularly ghastly illustration from a 19th century edition of Waverley. But very significantly through the biography written by his friend Philip Doddridge and the sermon which preceded that biography. Gardiner has an afterlife beyond the battle in literature and in the monuments of the battlefield. So why was he so significant? What was it about Colonel Gardiner that made his story so worth remembering? Let's have a look. Although by the end of his life, Colonel Gardiner lived in Prestonpans, he was in fact born further west over at Carradine. There is his home. This is William Forrest's map from the later 18th century. Bowness just at the top of the map over to the left-hand side, and then following along the coast road past Carradine Church, there is a little house called Burnfoot. And that is where our Colonel Gardiner is born. Just adding a layer on there to show you the image from Google Maps, putting Burnfoot on the right into perspective, and the smaller red mark further along is Carradine Church, which we will come back to later in our story. This is a photograph from the mid-1930s showing Burnfoot just about 20 years before it ceased to be occupied. So this is a good illustration as to what the property looked like. Two-storey, white-hulled, L-plan structure. It's right on the Forth coast, the coast to the right of the image here, with high banks and woodland behind it. It's on the edge of the estate of Carradine House. This is Burnfoot as it appears today, or rather about a year ago when I took these photos on my last visit. As you can see, it's very much overgrown, but you can still trace the outlines of the buildings. And if you're of a romantic heart, you can look out of the same windows which young James Gardiner did at the end of the 17th century. Let's give James Gardiner some family context then. He's born in 1688. We can see at the top left here his parents, Captain Patrick Gardiner from Torwood Head, just north of Falkirk, and Mary Hodge, or Hodges, of Gladsmuir in East Lothian, not far from Prestonpans. Now, Mary Hodges' brother, Therefore, our James Gardiner's uncle is Colonel Robert Hodges, and he has his own regiment. He's killed at the Battle of Steenkirk in 1692. A few years later, Gardiner's older brother, Robert, who's already in the army, is killed just 16 at the Siege of Namur in 1695. Followed a few years later by Patrick Gardiner, James's father, who's killed round about the time of the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. So very much a military family, and very much a family with a tradition of dying on campaign, unfortunately. Our young James Gardiner, he goes to school in Linlithgow, but he gets into lots of scrapes. He fights a number of duels as a boy. He has his cheek slashed in a sword fight, and he joins the army at a young age as an ensign. And by the time of his father's death, Gardiner too is heading out to campaign in Marlborough's wars. In terms of what Gardiner might have looked like, we have lots of engravings of Gardiner that appeared in copies of Doddridge's biography or in editions of Scott's Waverley. Mostly they are derivative of the central larger image. A nice portrait. We have one of these in the museum. You can see though on the left-hand side there, some of the derivative engravings are less flattering and less well executed. And like the one on the right there, some of them may well be completely imaginary or based on some lost picture that we don't have access to. The original engraving in the centre may be based on a portrait which is in a private collection, which we're currently researching to see if it still exists and whether we can get a decent image of it, because that might be a portrait that was painted in life. Gardiner's first major military exploit comes in 1706, and it comes here at Ramillies. Now, this is a later 18th century copy of a battle plan of the Battle of Ramillies, and you can see this in the museum. And the area of interest is this area in front of the church in Ramillies village itself, because this was attacked by a large force, which included Borthwick's regiment in the Dutch Brigade, Scottish regiment, in which Gardiner was an ensign. Thanks to the wonders of Google Earth, we're able to even look at the area in which this attack will have gone on. You'll recognise the church there on its high mound and the Allied attack coming across this open landscape to attack that heavily defended churchyard. There's a wonderful illustration of this by Shauna Brogan, which you can see in the book on the Battle of Ramillies, published by Osprey, and I wanted to show it to you here because it gives a sense of the drama of the assault on Ramillies village. These Marlboroughn battles were massive, especially compared to an engagement such as Prestonpans. Large numbers of people involved, high numbers of casualties too, and here we see Ensign James Gardiner being gunned down as the regiment rushes towards the churchyard walls. This could have been the end of our James. He's shot through the throat as he leads his men forwards. Now, he is left on the battlefield for dead. He is later found, though, reputedly by some French soldiers who mistake him for a French officer, and he is eventually taken to a nearby convent, where he is restored to health eventually, quite remarkably surviving what could have been a fatal life-ending wound. This does not put Gardiner off a military career. He rejoins his regiment once he's recovered, and he next comes to prominence at the Battle of Preston. Let's move then to the streets of Preston in the northwest of England in November 1715. Now, Colonel Gardiner was born in 1688. He dies in 1745, so his timeline is entirely bound up by the story of the Jacobite risings. In 1715, there were two Jacobite armies, one operating in Scotland, the other which had dashed into England, and at Preston it had got itself bottled up into the town, barricading the streets. Colonel Gardiner, who at this time was a captain of dragoons, was involved in launching attacks on those barricades and setting them to fire. The day after the main fighting, the Jacobite force surrenders. So Gardiner has had his first brush with the Jacobites. The Jacobites will, of course, come back into his story a little later. In the wake of the 15, Gardiner's career takes a slightly different turn. Still a dashing young cavalry officer with a distinguished career behind him, he's now attached to the embassy at Versailles, under the patronage of the Earl of Stair, one of the very powerful Dalrymples of the Lothians. Now, whilst he's there, he gains something of a reputation. The Happy Rake is his nickname, but his long-suffering mother keeps sending him the sorts of moral texts that she hopes will help him to mend his ways now that he's maturing. And so the story goes that one afternoon, he's waiting for his latest feminine liaison, and to kill the time, he picks up a book that's been sent to him by his mother, which Doddridge says is Heaven Taken by Storm by Watson. He reads this, and at this moment, he has a sort of voice or a vision of Christ on the cross. See, my wounds, are these the rewards of my suffering? And having had this experience, Gardiner determines to mend his ways. He decides to no longer model himself on the rakish model, but rather instead to become the model of the Christian soldier. Now, Alexander Carlyle, who knew Gardiner in his youth and heard him tell the story of his religious experience many times, disputes some of the details in how Doddridge relates it. But Doddridge also claims to be basing his account on what Gardiner had told him too. So there are obviously some details that were sensationalized, but otherwise this was a very well-known story. Gardiner was clearly comfortable telling it, and it's one of the reasons why Gardiner became such an important figure in evangelical circles in his later life and beyond. It also coincides with a period of his life where, of course, naturally a man starts to look at what he needs to do in order for stability and longevity, settling down a little bit after the adventures of his youth. Helped, no doubt, by the powerful patronage of Stair and a distinguished career, Gardiner is able to get himself an advantageous marriage. He marries Lady Frances Erskine, a daughter of the Earl of Buchan, in 1726, and a few years later, in 1733, they purchased Bankton House, formerly known as Olivestob, at Prestonpans. You can see Bankton House as it appears now after its restoration on the left there. Very fine house dating from the end of the 17th century, a bit like Gardiner himself. You can see it on this contemporary plan of the Battle of Prestonpans, still by its old name Olivestob there, although it seems to be during Gardiner's time that it changes its name. And as you can also allude from the plan, it is very close to the area of fighting when the Battle of Prestonpans comes round in 1745. Bankton today is still a private residence. It's subdivided into a number of apartments, but the ducat has been converted into a little museum, which does give you some information about the life of Gardiner and his relevance to the battle. The imposition of the railway line means that you no longer access Bankton the way that Gardiner himself did, however. We're looking up in this photograph the way that Gardiner would have got to his front door along a lovely tree-lined avenue. These magnificent trees here will remember Colonel Gardiner walking beneath them. By quirk of the parish boundaries, Bankton is in fact in Tranent parish, not Prestonpans, and so it's this church at Tranent that Gardiner would have attended, and it's here that those of his 13 children, all but 5 sadly, that didn't make it into adulthood, were buried. Although I say that, this is not the church itself in terms of its physical fabric that Gardiner would remember. The church was rebuilt from 1799 to 1800. And it's worth dwelling on that point just for a moment because it will become important later. 2 illustrations on the left there showing what old Tranent Church may have looked like. The basic form, the cruciform shape, is pretty clear. Whether or not it had a spire is disputed. But you can see from this diagram over here that there are fragments of the old stonework incorporated into the new building, some of which are still visible. Although the new building has been extended from the footprint of the old and is a much more rectangular shape. This will become important, but it also allows us to say that you can still find traces of the stonework that Colonel Gardiner will have looked upon as he attended church here at Tranent. Now, we're very fortunate, not least from the writings of Doddridge and Alexander Carlyle, and from others who knew Gardiner, such as Robert Blair, the minister up at Athelston Ford, that we get insights into the type of man that he was and the extent to which he was respected. We also have a number of letters that he himself wrote, not only about his military matters, but also family ones as well. There are some in the National Library of Scotland's collection. There are a couple even on display at our own museum here in Prestonpans that are from a private collection on long-term loan to us. And they, again, give us an insight, give us a sense of a rounded and real person. There's something very powerful about being able to see the handwriting of an individual from the past and get a sense of closeness to that person. Clearly, Gardiner took very hard the loss of his children and was very tender towards those who survived. He was always writing back from wherever he might have been posted, asking for their welfare. Also keen to ensure that connections and relations, anyone he might be able to support and patronise, were all attended to. In these senses, very typical mid-18th century gentleman, a stable, steady, well-respected member of the Prestonpans community. Gardiner is still very much a career soldier, however. He rises to the rank of lieutenant colonel. His regiment is posted variously around Britain in the later 1730s, and it's whilst it's in Northampton that he meets and befriends Philip Doddridge, who would be so important to preserving Gardiner's legacy. He's an interesting type of officer. We get accounts of him being so tender to the cares of his men that he ensures they are regularly attending church services, and he pops in to check on them at their billets and check that their welfare is being looked to. One does wonder whether this is exactly the sort of leadership that some of his men might have managed to avoid if they could do so. The last thing you want is the colonel turning up at your billets unannounced regularly to check in on you. Nevertheless, this is presented to us as an attentive, diligent, and humane officer. When the British join the War of the Austrian Succession, Gardiner goes across to Europe on campaign, and his health seems to take a severe turn for the worst. The letters that we have on display in the gallery are written during this period in 1742 from Ghent back to dear Fanny at Bankton. And in 1743, he gets the opportunity at last to become full colonel. The opportunity is for the colonelcy of the 13th Dragoons. They are based at this point not on the continent, but back home in the Lothians. And so it's an opportunity not only for promotion, but for a man who's unwell to retire away from the war front and back home without any disgrace. So Gardiner takes command of the 13th Dragoons. You can see him here in a still from the animated story of Gardiner's life that's shown in Bankton Ducat that the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust put together some years ago. Now there his green-cuffed regiment being reviewed. Now, Gardiner's regiment had spent most of its recent history in Ireland. It hadn't been actively engaged since 1715, and it's doubtful, perhaps, whether Gardiner was able, in the short time that he was colonel, to build much of a rapport with his men, and it seems likely that most of the day-to-day administration was, in fact, done by his lieutenant colonel, Shugborough Whitney. Like most people, Gardiner is not prepared for the last Jacobite rising to suddenly burst into life in the summer of 1745. At the time, he's actually on his way to Scarborough to take the waters, continuing his health battles, but he rushes back immediately to take command of his regiment. When General Cope marches north from Stirling on the 19th of August, that's the red line on the map here, Gardiner's regiment doesn't go north. The two regiments of dragoons, Gardiner's and Hamilton's, stay in the south to protect the lowlands, largely because the terrain in the north isn't considered suitable for mounted troops. Gardiner is in control of the two regiments that are based down in the lowlands, But as you can see, whilst General Cope's expedition takes him across to Aberdeen, the blue line of the Jacobite army is coming down directly towards Gardiner, who retreats with his dragoons ahead of the Jacobites back towards Edinburgh. It could be argued that Gardiner, with up to 700 or so dragoons at his command, could have been a lot more disruptive to the 2,500 Highlanders that were breaking over the Firth of Forth on their march towards the capital. But it's possible that the dragoons simply weren't sufficiently trained and disciplined at this point to be able to undertake the sort of complicated operations that might, in our ideal dreams, have been enacted by an active force defending the lowlands. Nevertheless, the reality simply is that Gardiner withdraws to Edinburgh, and there he is superseded by the arrival of Thomas Fawkes to take command of both regiments. Gardiner from this point then is just in command of his own 300 or so 13th Dragoons. They retreat from Edinburgh back to Prestonpans whilst awaiting General Cope's arrival at Dunbar. There's an interesting story about the time that they have there. Gardiner requests permission from Fawkes to go home to Bankton for a night's sleep. And during the night, there is a false alarm that the Jacobites are approaching, and it takes a lot of effort to bang on the doors and rouse Gardiner up and get him into the saddle and away to safety down the road heading east. That false alarm was presumed to have been spread by the farmers of Prestonpans who didn't want those dragoons eating up their newly collected harvest. Gardiner's regiment, as with Hamilton's dragoons, links up with General Cope, however, and then marches back to Prestonpans, where they face the battle on the 20th and 21st of September. When the armies finally deploy for the clash of arms on the morning of the 21st of September 1745, Colonel Gardiner is positioned here on this map. He's at the head of the reserve squadron of his regiment, with Shugborough Witney being up front with the other two squadrons close to the British cannon. Now, the Jacobite attack falls very heavily on this wing of the army. Before the battle had even started, Gardiner's horse is said to have been skittish, and he was advised by no less a person than the Earl of Loudon himself that he should change a horse if he possibly could before the battle started. We don't know whether he found the time to do so. But as the line was overwhelmed, because Gardiner was in a reserve position, he wasn't killed in the first onslaught. Instead, as the lines broke backwards, he made his famous last stand in the open field behind the position of the British Army. And it's a moment which has been immortalised in art and in literature. This is William Allen's mid-19th century portrayal of the death of Gardiner in the centre of the battlefield of Prestonpans. You see the Jacobite clansmen charging in there. There's Seaton Palace just sneaking in behind, and Prince Charlie leading, erroneously shown on horseback. Gardiner here in the centre of the composition as the dragoons and the foot soldiers flee around him, about to be struck down. Now, Gardiner had, according to Alexander Carlyle, predicted his own death in the days leading up to the battle. They'd walked together in the gardens of the manse at Dunbar, and Gardiner had predicted that barely a handful of his men should be expected to stand if it came to an open fight. Perhaps that level of confidence might have filtered through into his men. Nevertheless, Gardiner behaved bravely on the battlefield itself. He is said to have seen a small gaggle of redcoat soldiers trying to hold their nerve as the army collapsed around them, and crying out, "Those men shall die for want of an officer," he rode across to support them. He was shot once or perhaps twice, and then he was struck by a Lochaber axe or by a sword, according to various tellings, and he fell close to a hawthorn tree. You can just see it sneaking into the picture here, and was, according to evidence given by another junior officer at the official inquiry the following year, he was found to have at least one gunshot wound and 6 or so slashing wounds upon his body. A more recent picture, again, one that can be found in our museum, this by Andy Hillhouse, and it shows, perhaps stripped of the romance and given a little bit more of the gritty violence, Gardiner's end was clearly bloody, traumatic, and brutal. Again, the thorn tree dominates the image, and beyond the edge of the battle, the very fringes of it, there, Gardiner's own home at Bankton House. After the battle, Gardiner was found by one of his servants who came up from Bankton looking for his master and found him beneath the thorn tree. He was just about still alive, although most of his clothes had been stripped by the Highlanders, we're told. The servant placed him on a cart and then took him up the wagon way to this building here, which is Trinent Manse, which is just at the edge of the churchyard on the south side of Trinent Churchyard. Inside the manse was Reverend Cunningham and two visiting sisters, Beatrix and Mary Jenkinson. These had met Bonnie Prince Charlie by chance in Duddingston just a few days before. They were the daughters of the minister of Athelstan Ford, and they were on their way back home when they'd got tied up in the aftermath of the battle at Prestonpans. He was nursed here for a few hours, but his injuries were so severe, of course, and he died probably by around 11 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of September. And here, in another one of the gritty scenes from the story of the battle painted by Andrew Hillhouse, we see the story of how one of the sisters is said to have been looking after Gardiner with the Reverend Cunningham upstairs, whilst the other sister provided food and distraction to some of the hungry Highlanders who came in looking for some grub after their battlefield exploits. You can see out of the window the Trinent Church there in the immediate aftermath of the fighting. Reverend Cunningham would go on to inform Blakeney at Stirling Castle of the events of the battle, from which a plan would be drawn up that was later to influence some of the battle plans published of Prestonpans. It's worth diverting for a moment just to mention the thorn tree in a little more detail. Look at Forrest's late 18th century map of the area. Thorn tree here in the centre, illustrated and labelled very clearly, very boldly. Doesn't need any further explanation than that. It is understood why that thorn tree is worthy of reference there in the middle. A farm that wasn't there during the time of the battle but grew up shortly afterwards adopted the Thorntree name, of course. And although the modern extent of Prestonpans comes right out to this point, we can be very clear as to where the Thorntree was because it was standing until the 1920s. It's there marked just as prominently in early Ordnance Survey maps as well. Look on the right, and we see from an 18th century edition of Dougal Graham's verse epic of the 45. He also claims to have been a witness to many of these events, and the thorn tree on the schematic plan published of the battle is very clearly identified as the thorn tree where Gardiner fell. Philip Doddridge, in his account of Gardiner's death, doesn't mention the thorn tree. It seems pretty clear to me that the thorn tree association comes locally. It's picked up by Adam Skirving in his Poetry and Songs of the Battle, and I think that is a locally rooted, pardon the pun, association between the thorn tree and Gardiner that develops quite independently of the fame of Doddridge's Gardiner. It's such an important landmark that it is photographed here in the 1850s. It is illustrated for engravings and book plates, and it is also used as a source of wood for souvenirs, including the National Museum, where they have a snuff box made from the thorn tree. It was propped up with iron bands after it began to die. The last remnants of it, however, blew down in the 1920s, and subsequently a few pieces were chopped up, one now on display in our museum, another in store at the National War Museum collection in Edinburgh, and a smaller fragment in the collection of the East Lothian Council Museum Service. A few days after the battle, once things have calmed down, but whilst there are still wounded men being treated in many of the houses closer to the battlefield, Colonel Gardiner is laid to rest in the grounds of Trinent Church, the church that he had attended in life in the 12 years or so that he had lived in this community. This is where it's important for us to go back to our plans of how the church had developed at the end of the 18th century, because there is currently no marked grave for Colonel Gardiner. We don't know exactly where he was laid to rest, but an American travel writer, Andrew Bigelow, does tell us that he came to look for Gardiner's grave and was disappointed when he came over in around 1819. Now, he gives us a little bit of information that he'd extracted from various local sources at the time, and what we think is that Gardiner was buried somewhere around here, just outside the southwest corner of the church, which means that when in 1799, 1800, this end of the church was extended in its footprint, then that extension was built over the last resting place of Colonel Gardiner. Bigelow tells us that there had been a low mound marking Gardiner's burial place, but that it had been trodden down by the workmen as the building was taken place. So Gardiner's burial spot was not recorded, but that doesn't mean that he isn't remembered, of course. In fact, let's go back to where we began, where Gardiner began, at Burnfoot House at Carridden. This is an access point, probably as part of the estate at Carridden House. On the other side of this overgrown wall, you can still find this very worn inscription in Gardiner's memory. Now, it's very difficult to make out the text, but fortunately, a copy of the text has been installed elsewhere. A short distance to the west of Burnfoot, you might remember I marked its location on a slide right at the beginning of the presentation, is Carridden Church, which now in ruins, can nevertheless boast this plaque on the outside wall in memory of Gardiner. This is the text that is on that worn stone over at Burnfoot. This was placed here in 1963. So Colonel Gardiner's burial spot might not be officially marked with a grave, but there is a memorial stone for him at Burnfoot, where he was born. There is the copy of the memorial text here at Carridden Kirk, and there is, of course, the obelisk and the thorn tree monument over on the battlefield and by Bankton House. So he's not short of monuments, even if his grave itself was unmarked. And quite a large reason for that is Philip Doddridge. Doddridge was Gardiner's friend. They were closely aligned philosophically and religiously. And having heard of the death of his friend, Doddridge delivered a sermon in Northampton, as you can see from the printed copy of it here, titled "The Christian Warrior Animated and Crowned, a sermon occasioned by the heroic death of the Honourable Colonel James Gardiner." The sermon was well received, and so Doddridge published it. The publication of the sermon was well received, and so Doddridge worked it up into a full biography, a copy of which you can see on the left there. In fact, you can see a number of copies in our museum because this book proved a massive hit. It went through countless editions through the 18th century following the first publication in 1747. Doddridge is pretty clear as to what his sources are. He says that as well as basing it on his own conversations and correspondence with Gardiner, he also talks to the widow, Lady Gardiner, who very soon sells up at Bankton, and the family's association with Prestonpans comes to an end. It is also said that many of Gardiner's papers are lost or disordered in the Jacobite occupation of the house when it serves as a hospital in the aftermath of the battle. But nevertheless, the Doddridge account of Gardiner's life contains much information and anecdote that we wouldn't otherwise have available to us. We also, as I've mentioned a few times, have information from Alexander Carlyle, son of the minister of Prestonpans Church at the time, and some of that challenges some of the statements that Doddridge makes. Nevertheless, the important thing about Doddridge's Life of Colonel Gardiner is that it is a huge sensation. It's published right across Scotland and England and into Northern America as well during the 18th and early 19th century. This has an influence on how people approach the story of the Battle of Prestonpans. It also has an influence on Walter Scott, who, as many of you will know, spent time as a boy in Prestonpans and will have picked up many of these stories himself. And when he writes Waverley, that's published in 1815, he makes Gardiner an important character, and the death of Colonel Gardiner becomes the principal climactic and heavily illustrated moment in the centre of Scott's story, which helps us to understand the scale and drama of this memorial obelisk from 1853. See how it sits on an artificial mound. Behind me, as I'm taking the photograph, is the avenue leading up to Bankton House. So from the monument, you can see where Gardiner lived. But on the other side, on the north side of the monument, is the railway line, which had been put in just 10 years before the monument is erected. So as you passed through in the second half of the 19th century, on your train to Edinburgh, you drove through Prestonpans battlefield, you passed within sight of the churchyard at Tranent, you then saw Bankton House, you saw the massive monument to Gardiner on its little mound so that you can get a good clear view from your train carriage as you head towards Edinburgh into Waverley railway station beside the Scott Monument. So is this a monument to Colonel Gardiner alone, or is it a monument to Walter Scott and 19th century tourism? Colonel Gardiner's story is a dramatic and fascinating story. His life and career are absolutely engaging. For the British Army at Prestonpans, there were few good news stories they could share, and I hesitate to refer to the death of a senior officer as good news. But the fact that he was so distinguished, and the fact that he died bravely, and the fact that he was so well respected and religiously devout, and unequivocally hostile to Jacobitism, meant that he could be held up as a sort of pro-government martyr. So, if you wanted to tell the story or illustrate the story of the Battle of Prestonpans, for a long time it would have been difficult to do so from the perspective of what a great Jacobite victory. But you could engage with the story safely, dramatically, and elegantly from the perspective of Colonel Gardiner. I hope you'll join us for other investigations into some of the people who lived around the battlefield, and I hope you'll join us at the museum, where you can see many of the artworks and artefacts we've talked about today. Thank you.